Imagine carrying a secret within you, one encoded in your very DNA. A secret so rare that scientists can trace it back over 1,500 years to a single migration. A secret that sets your ancestry apart from every other ethnic group in Europe. This is the story of the Romani DNA, a genetic mystery that has defied time, assimilation, and history itself. Unlike most populations that merge and evolve with their surroundings, the Romani have kept a genetic fingerprint that remains strikingly distinct. Tracing back through generations, scientists have uncovered a genetic trail leading directly to the Indian subcontinent. But the journey doesn't end there. As the Romani migrated through Persia, the Middle East, and the Byzantine Empire, their DNA picked up unique markers, yet it never lost its core South Asian ancestry. What makes their DNA so different? It starts with something called the founder effect. When a small group of people separates from a larger population, their genetic traits become amplified. This is exactly what happened with the Romani. Their Y-DNA haplogroup H1A, nearly exclusive to their population, links them directly to India. Meanwhile, their mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, also carries rare markers found only in South Asia. This level of genetic preservation is unheard of for a group that has lived in Europe for centuries. Even more fascinating is how Romani DNA has remained intact despite generations of migration, persecution, and forced assimilation. Unlike other groups that gradually integrate into their host populations, the Romani maintained strong cultural barriers, practicing endogamy, marrying within their own community. This not only preserved their language and traditions, but also kept their genetic signature largely unchanged. Today, genetic studies confirm that the Romani are an Indo-European people with deep South Asian roots. Their DNA is a living time capsule, offering a direct link to ancient populations of India and Pakistan. This discovery not only reshapes what we know about Romani history, but also challenges our understanding of migration, identity, and survival itself. The Romani people's DNA isn't just unique. It's a biological record of an ancient journey that started in the Indian subcontinent and stretched across continents, empires, and centuries. But while their origins have been debated for generations, modern genetic science has uncovered something remarkable. Their ancestry isn't just a theory. It's written in their blood. Using genome-wide single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP analysis, scientists have traced the genetic origins of the Romani to northwest India, particularly the Punjab, Rajasthan, and Gujarat regions. But there's another twist. Genetic similarities also link them to Pakistani populations like the Sindhi, Pashtun, and Balochi. This suggests that the early Romani ancestors may not have left from a single point, but rather migrated in waves, gathering different genetic influences along the way. Their journey westward didn't just shape their history. It shaped their very DNA. Genetic studies show that Romani DNA has higher levels of homozygosity, meaning their genes have remained unusually pure and preserved over centuries. This is because of a strong founder effect, a genetic bottleneck that occurred when a small group of people left India and formed isolated communities, preventing much genetic mixing with outsiders. But what's truly fascinating is that, despite settling across dozens of different countries, Romani groups share consistent genetic markers, proof that their ancestors all came from the same single origin before dispersing across the world. Whether in Spain, Romania, Turkey, or Hungary, Romani genetic patterns show a common South Asian ancestry, even though their cultural identities have evolved in vastly different ways. The genetic evidence is undeniable. The Romani are not European by origin, and their history isn't just a story told in old records. It's etched into their DNA, waiting to be read by science. For centuries, the Romani people have been misunderstood, often mistaken for the local populations they lived among. But while language, traditions, and even appearance may have changed over time, their DNA tells a different story. One of the most striking genetic features of the Romani is their Y-DNA and mtDNA haplogroups, which reveal their paternal and maternal lineage. The most dominant paternal haplogroup found in Romani men is H1A, M82, a genetic marker that originated in South Asia and is almost absent in non-Romani Europeans. This single marker is like a genetic fingerprint, proving that the Romani's paternal ancestors did not come from Europe, but rather from India. However, their maternal lineage tells a more complex story. Unlike their paternal genes, which have remained largely South Asian, the Romani's mtDNA, inherited from the mother, shows a much higher frequency of European haplogroups. This means that while Romani men largely married within their own communities, Romani women often intermarried with local European populations, absorbing genetic influences over time. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Despite centuries of migration and mixing, Romani DNA still carries distinctive genetic signatures that set them apart. Their autosomal DNA, which comes from both parents, shows a unique blend of South Asian, Middle Eastern, and European ancestry, but with clear signs of a strong genetic bottleneck. This bottleneck effect occurred because the original Romani ancestors came from a small, isolated population, meaning their genetic diversity was reduced and highly preserved as they moved westward. This preservation of DNA, combined with centuries of selective isolation, is why even today, genetic tests can identify Romani ancestry with remarkable precision. Their DNA is like a historical roadmap, showing not only where they came from but also how their genetic identity remained intact despite centuries of dispersion. The Romani people's journey across continents wasn't just a migration, it was a genetic transformation. As they moved from India to Europe, their DNA absorbed traces of the regions they passed through, yet somehow retained a distinct genetic identity unlike any other. But how exactly did their DNA change? One of the most revealing aspects of Romani genetics is the gradual shift in their autosomal DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents. While their earliest ancestors in India had purely South Asian genetic markers, their centuries-long migration introduced new layers of ancestry. As they passed through Persia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, they mixed with local populations, absorbing small amounts of genetic material from each region. This left behind subtle but detectable traces of Middle Eastern and Caucasian ancestry in their genome. However, the most significant genetic transformation occurred when they entered Europe. Here, their DNA shows evidence of admixture with Balkan and Eastern European populations, particularly in their maternal lineage. This European influence became more pronounced over time, especially in groups that settled in Romania, Hungary, and the Iberian Peninsula. Yet, despite this mixing, genetic studies show that Romani DNA remains unique, with clear separations from both their South Asian ancestors and the European populations they lived among. What's even more intriguing is that while their autosomal DNA shows gradual changes, their Y-DNA, paternal lineage, has remained largely unchanged, reinforcing the idea that Romani men continued marrying within their own groups, while Romani women had more genetic interaction with local communities. This explains why their paternal lineage still carries strong South Asian signatures, despite centuries of migration. Even today, advanced genetic analysis can map the Romani migration by tracing these subtle shifts in their DNA. The genetic footprints left behind tell a story of resilience, a people who adapted to new lands but never lost the genetic thread that ties them to their origins. For centuries, the Romani people have existed as a distinct ethnic group within Europe, yet their genetic identity remains separate from the populations they've lived alongside. How is that possible? The answer lies in their strict cultural traditions, which acted as an invisible genetic shield, preserving their unique lineage despite centuries of migration and assimilation pressures. Unlike many nomadic groups who intermarried freely with local populations, the Romani adhered to strong endogamy practices, meaning they primarily married within their own communities. This limited genetic dilution, ensuring that their South Asian genetic markers remained intact even after centuries in Europe. However, this wasn't just a random tradition. It was deeply rooted in their social structure, where marriage outside the group was often discouraged or outright forbidden. Another key factor was their social isolation, often imposed by external discrimination. Throughout history, Romani communities were marginalized, labeled as outsiders, and in some cases, legally restricted from intermarrying with non-Romani populations. This forced separation further reinforced their genetic distinctiveness, as they had fewer opportunities for widespread genetic mixing. But genetics alone don't explain their uniqueness. The Romani also maintained linguistic and cultural barriers that strengthened their identity. Their language, heavily influenced by Sanskrit, acted as a marker of belonging, making it easier to distinguish insiders from outsiders. Even their traditions, such as specific funeral rites, purity laws, and social customs, helped reinforce their tight-knit communities, creating an additional layer of cultural insulation that inadvertently preserved their genetic heritage. Yet, despite these barriers, genetic studies do show regional variations among Romani groups, proving that while they largely retained their distinct DNA, subtle intermingling with host populations did occur in certain areas. The Romani of Spain, for instance, show higher traces of Iberian DNA, while those in Bulgaria and Romania have absorbed more Balkan genetic influences. But even with these variations, their core South Asian genetic markers remain strong, proving that their cultural resilience directly influenced their genetic continuity. One of the biggest mysteries in genetic studies is how certain populations retain strong ancestral markers despite centuries of migration and displacement. The Romani people are a prime example of this phenomenon. While most ethnic groups gradually blend into their surroundings over time, the Romani have retained unmistakable genetic traces of their South Asian origins. But what does their DNA actually reveal? Modern genome-wide studies have confirmed that Romani DNA carries distinctive South Asian markers, particularly from regions like Punjab, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. However, what makes their genetic structure even more fascinating is the presence of unique founder lineages, meaning that most Romani people today descend from a relatively small group of ancestors who left India around 1,500 years ago. This explains why their genetic signatures remain so consistent across Europe, despite their wide geographic spread. Unlike other populations that have mixed extensively with neighboring groups, Romani DNA shows long stretches of homozygosity, a clear indicator of generations of endogamy. This is why certain haplogroups, such as H1A Y-DNA and M5A1 mDNA, are disproportionately common among Romani men and women, while nearly absent in non-Romani Europeans. But their genetic code isn't just a story of preservation. It also reveals a complex history of adaptation. When Romani groups migrated through the Middle East and into Europe, they inevitably encountered new genetic influences. Over time, some populations absorbed traces of Middle Eastern, Caucasian, and European DNA, creating regional genetic variations within the broader Romani identity. The Romani of the Balkans, for instance, show higher frequencies of Y haplogroup EV13, likely acquired through interactions with local populations. Meanwhile, Spanish Romani tend to carry more J2 haplogroups, a lineage common in Iberia. Despite these adaptations, one thing remains clear: the genetic identity of the Romani people has endured. Their DNA acts as a biological record of their migration, resilience, and cultural unity, providing a deeper understanding of their journey from South Asia to Europe. Throughout history, many ethnic groups have intermingled, their genetic traces fading over generations. But the Romani people defy this pattern. Despite their migrations, their DNA tells a story of isolation, survival, and selective adaptation, a genetic footprint unlike any other. One of the most striking aspects of Romani genetics is their high degree of homozygosity, meaning they carry long stretches of identical DNA inherited from both parents. This isn't random. It results from centuries of strict endogamy, where Romani communities primarily married within their own groups. Over time, this reinforced certain genetic traits while minimizing outside influences. But what truly sets Romani DNA apart is the presence of strong genetic bottlenecks, events where a small number of ancestors gave rise to a much larger population. These bottlenecks created a founder effect, where certain rare genetic markers became disproportionately common. For instance, some Romani populations share specific mutations linked to hereditary disorders that are rarely found outside their communities. These include conditions like congenital myasthenic syndrome and certain blood disorders, which scientists use as genetic clues to trace Romani ancestry. Yet, despite this historical isolation, Romani DNA does show localized variations based on where different groups settled. In Central Europe, some Romani carry genetic markers reflecting Slavic admixture, while in Spain, they exhibit traces of Iberian ancestry. However, these influences remain secondary to their overwhelmingly South Asian genetic signature, which persists after more than 1,000 years. This unique genetic landscape has made the Romani people a subject of deep scientific interest. Their DNA is a living record of a migration unlike any other, preserving an ancestral connection that remains remarkably intact even today. For most ethnic groups, genetic identity fades as they mix with surrounding populations. But the Romani people have preserved a distinct genetic lineage, shaped by a unique history of migration and isolation. What role did selection pressures and adaptation play in this? One key factor is natural selection. As the Romani journeyed across continents, they encountered new climates, unfamiliar diseases, and dietary changes. Over centuries, their genetic makeup adapted to these challenges. For example, certain Romani populations showed genetic resistance to infectious diseases like tuberculosis, likely due to repeated exposure in historically poor living conditions. In contrast, some genetic predispositions, like higher rates of lactose intolerance, suggest that their ancestors never fully adapted to a dairy-based diet common in Europe. Another striking feature of Romani genetics is the prevalence of unique metabolic traits. Scientists have discovered genetic markers in Romani DNA linked to fast glucose metabolism, which could have provided an evolutionary advantage during food scarcity. However, in modern times, this trait has been linked to higher risks of type 2 diabetes, as dietary patterns have shifted. Moreover, cultural traditions played a role in shaping their genetic distinctiveness. The Romani practice of early marriage within their own communities reinforced certain genetic traits across generations, further distinguishing them from surrounding populations. This helped maintain their South Asian ancestry, while gradually integrating minor genetic influences from the regions they settled in. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Romani genetics is their ability to retain ancestral markers, while also developing localized variations. Unlike most nomadic groups, whose genetic identity gets diluted over time, the Romani have maintained a remarkable level of genetic continuity, despite over 1,000 years of migration. Most ethnic groups evolve gradually through assimilation and cultural blending, but for the Romani, their DNA tells a story of resilience against genetic erosion. Despite centuries of migration and external pressures, their genetic identity remains surprisingly intact. How did this happen? One of the most important factors is founder effects. When a small population splits off from a larger one, the genetic diversity in that group is limited to the genes carried by its founders. For the Romani, their ancestors left India in a small, distinct group, meaning their genetic blueprint was set in stone from the very beginning. Over time, this limited genetic pool was reinforced by strict social structures, where marriage often occurred within the community, preventing significant genetic dilution. Another key element is bottleneck events, periods where populations shrink drastically before growing again. The Romani have faced wars, forced expulsions, and genocides, which repeatedly reduced their numbers. Each time their population rebounded, it was from a smaller genetic base, preserving their original DNA with minimal external influence. Yet, while their core ancestry remains distinct, subtle genetic traces from Europe, the Middle East, and even North Africa have been detected. This tells us that admixture did occur, but only to a limited extent. The reason? Social isolation, not necessarily by choice, but often due to discrimination. This separation slowed genetic blending, ensuring their DNA remained unique. Interestingly, despite their mobility, the Romani exhibit strong genetic clustering, meaning Romani groups from different countries often share more DNA with each other than with their non-Romani neighbors. This highlights how cultural continuity reinforced their genetic legacy, allowing them to maintain a consistent ancestral identity even while being scattered across the world. The story of Romani DNA isn't just one of migration, it's one of endurance. Against all odds, their genetic signature remains as distinct today as it was 1,000 years ago. The Romani people have lived among diverse civilizations for centuries, yet their genetic identity remains remarkably distinct. But what happens when genetics meets culture? How does a population so deeply intertwined with different societies still retain a unique genetic signature? The answer lies in the Romani's strict social structures, deep-rooted traditions, and a fascinating genetic phenomenon known as endogamy. Unlike most migrating populations that blend genetically with locals over time, the Romani practiced endogamous marriages, meaning they primarily married within their own community. This wasn't just a cultural preference, but an unspoken rule reinforced by social norms. As a result, their genetic blueprint remained largely unaltered despite their widespread dispersion across continents. Another powerful factor is the oral transmission of cultural identity. Unlike written histories that can be lost, Romani traditions were passed down verbally, ensuring that each generation inherited not just their DNA, but also the values that protected it. Their language, heavily influenced by Sanskrit, acted as a genetic and cultural marker, reinforcing a sense of identity separate from the host populations they lived among. Yet, the influence of external cultures was not entirely absent. Over time, subtle genetic traces from European, Middle Eastern, and Balkan populations made their way into the Romani gene pool. However, these influences were limited, as Romani communities often lived on the fringes of mainstream society, facing social exclusion that inadvertently preserved their genetic lineage. One of the most intriguing aspects of Romani DNA is that, despite centuries of migration, their genetic clusters remain consistent across different regions. Romani groups in Spain, Romania, and the UK still share high genetic similarities, proving that their identity was shaped by more than just geography. It was an unbreakable fusion of bloodlines and culture. Genetics can reveal where we come from, but culture decides who we remain. And for the Romani, it was this delicate balance between adaptation and preservation that safeguarded their uniqueness across generations.